Our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Sung Chan Lim, better known as Slim, helps CEOs lead with empathy, the kind of empathy that not only sparks creativity and insight, but also reduces stress and burnout. In particular, he guides startup and small business founders and co-founders on the challenging journey of innovation. His focus lies in helping them learn to more effectively perceive and interact with one another, their employees, their customers, and so as to cultivate the mindset, relationship, and culture required to promote insight and innovation. So let's welcome Slim to the stage to talk to us about realizing empathy. Thank you.
Great. It was about 15 years ago. I had a close friend who was suffering from bipolar depression. And as a close friend who cared, I was determined to solve her problem. I started by reading as many books, articles, journals as I can find. And then after learning the science of depression, I went to a local support group looking for some practical advice. What I learned there was that the best way I can help my friend was to try and empathize with her. And what they meant by this was that the next time my friend would get depressed, I was to sit down with her and listen to her carefully. And if I could understand how she's feeling and why, I was to reflect this back to her. I was pleasantly surprised. I felt like I could totally do this. So I tried. And it was a lot more difficult than I thought. The whole time I was listening to her, she kept yelling, screaming, and bawling. She kept saying, "I don't understand." So what was I supposed to do? I kept revising my story over and over and over again, hoping that I would eventually get through to her. But I couldn't. Nearly half an hour passed by, and I was just sitting there with all my energy drained, unable to get through to her, feeling completely stuck. But then something occurred to me. All of a sudden, I remembered that earlier in the day, I had said something to her which in hindsight was hurtful. So I told her that with an apology. And like magic, she stopped yelling, she stopped screaming as she sat there sobbing. Then after a long pause, she looked up and said, "Thank you. I thought you'd never say that." I'd finally empathized with her. What I realize now is that everything I've been telling her up to that point was framed in such a way that it was all her fault. And I had nothing to do with it. And this was not because I had malicious intent. I had great intentions. I cared for her. Yet all I'd been doing the whole time was making things worse by hurting her feelings even more and draining my energy in the same process. So here's what I learned from this as I reflect on this incident. We problem solve because we care. And sometimes this works well, yet there are situations where the more we try to problem solve, the more we struggle or make things worse. Now, the question I kept asking since that day was why? Why is this so? And I wanted to share my understanding and explanation of what I've come to understand. Now, in the beginning of the story, I started off not empathizing with my friend, which is to say that I was feeling as if I were disconnected or at odds with my friend. then in the end, I ended up empathizing with her. Which is to say that I was in a state where I was feeling as if I were connected or at one with her. Now here's the thing. The whole time I wanted to empathize with her. The desire was there. But let's see what I actually did. First of all, I distanced myself to separate myself as a problem solver from her, who was the problem. Why? Because she was the one with the problem, not I. How can the problem solver be a part of the problem? It can't. It makes no sense. But of course, in the end, what did I learn? I was, in fact, a part of the problem. I was influencing the problem. My friend was feeling the way she was, not because of her depression, but because of something hurtful I had said. And yet the whole time I was so fueled by a sense of responsibility, the responsibility of doing my job as a problem solver well, that I was blinded to the fact that I may actually be a part of the problem, or that I may have an influence on the problem. I also elevated myself above her to the point where I considered myself to have the authority to judge. Why? Because I had spent months studying depression. I even went to a local support group. I may not have been the world's expert, but I thought I was surely a better judge than she was. Or so I thought. But once again, she was feeling the way she was, not because of her depression, but because of something hurtful I had said. I didn't even remember I had said that. Does that make me a good judge or a bad one? In essence, after elevating myself, I'd become so concerned with judging what is right, wrong, good, or bad, that I failed to think of the possibility that I may not know enough to authoritatively judge. So she was not wrong to reject my understanding. In fact, if anybody was wrong, it was me. I was wrong. Finally, I strongly held on to the separation and judgment. Why? Because I was seeking conclusion and relief. Do you think it was comfortable or uncomfortable for me to see her feeling depressed? It was uncomfortable. So much so that I wanted this to be over with as soon as possible. In fact, concluding this as soon as possible was so important to me that I went into the conversation prepared with a solution. Guess what solution I had in mind? She had to cheer up. What a beautifully simple solution, right? But of course, in the end, I not only realized that my solution was wrong, but that the actual solution was completely new and unexpected. Now, with these blinders on, is it any wonder that I struggled? What's ironic is that all throughout my interaction, I cared. And yet, as you can see from the circles, I was making it more difficult for us to empathize. And that's not all. As I was distancing, elevating, and resisting, can you imagine how my friend must have felt? Separated and standing below me? Now, what about me? I felt resentful and indignant. Why? Because I was putting in so much of my energy trying to solve her problem, and yet she was not even appreciating my effort. Is it any wonder that I was feeling drained and exhausted? I've come to call the collection of these three ways of being as the problem solver's mindset. And I also call what we do when we adopt this mindset problem solving. Now, once again, there's nothing inherently wrong with problem solving. We problem solve because we care. And this sometimes works well. But there are also situations where the more we try to problem solve, the more we struggle or make the situation worse. Now, in my practice, I help CEOs become the kind of leader that can guide their team through the difficult process of innovation. And most of them start by considering themselves as problem solvers. And their employees are the problems. They say the problem is employees are disengaged, entitled, lacking ownership, lacking empathy. Now, when I talk to the employees, guess what they say? Upper management's the problem. They're stubborn, stingy, lacking integrity, lacking empathy. Whatever the problem may be, we treat each other as problems to be solved. And with this mindset, does a problem get solved? Rarely. In fact, it often makes things worse. And yet we keep doing this over and over and over again, even when we know it doesn't work. I think what's going on is that we feel stuck, just the way I felt stuck with my friend. We're doing our best to problem solve, but we're struggling, and we hate the fact that we're making things worse. But without an alternative, we don't know what else to do. So what I wish to do today is at least make it explicit that there is an alternative to problem solving. It's not an easy alternative, but there is one. And it's an alternative I've come to call realizing empathy. Now, what do I mean by realizing empathy? If we make a linear timeline where we're not empathizing is at point A, and empathizing is at point B, our empathy sometimes realizes involuntarily. This happens without any effort. It's very easy. It's what happens when somebody says something we agree with. But there are also times when there's a hill we must climb to go from A to B. In this case, we have to realize our empathy deliberately. So realizing empathy is an attempt to move ourselves up this hill. This does not happen automatically. We only realize our empathy when we want to, because it can be difficult, sometimes very difficult, as it was the case with my friend. And realizing empathy differs from problem solving in many ways, but I want to share 3 of them today. The first difference I want to talk about is a difference in mindset. Merely wanting to realize our empathy is insufficient, because realizing empathy requires a shift in mindset, a mindset other than the problem solver's mindset. Let me show you a video to illustrate what I mean by this. Please watch very carefully. What did you see? See the ball rolling uphill, right? There are usually 2 types of responses to this video. One is, oh, I got it, magnets. Raise your hand if you thought that way. The other type is, whoa, how can that be? It's impossible. And there's nothing wrong with either ways of seeing, but they're different ways of seeing the same thing. If you said that's magnets, you, in that moment, adopted the problem solver's mindset. When we adopt a problem solver's mindset, we assume the problem is outside of us, that we have no relationship or influence on the problem. So it makes sense to think that the problem is over there, that there's a magnet over there. With the problem solver's mindset, we also want to judge as quickly as we can. So the moment we think we have enough information, we judge. Oh, I figured it out. It's magnets. Done. And we tend to hold on to that judgment and separation. Now, on the other hand, if you said, whoa, how can that be? It's impossible. You, in that moment, adopted what I call the paradox resolver's mindset. Now, paradox is a conflict between our expectation of how reality should be versus how reality actually is. It's a very interesting idea. Now, when you adopt the paradox resolver's mindset, you do not separate yourself from the problem. In fact, you actively participate in the problem by saying things like, what am I missing? It's as if it's obvious that we are missing something. That we acknowledge the fact that the problem is not outside of us, that we may be influencing the problem. We also feel ambivalent. We think, well, according to gravity, the ball shouldn't be moving uphill, but I'm seeing with my own eyes that it is. I'm feeling conflicted. Yet at the same time, we strangely appreciate this ambivalence. In fact, ambivalence is what makes paradoxes worthy of our attention. And this opens us up to willingly let go, at least temporarily, of any preconceived notions or judgments for the sake of learning something new. Now, we're going to return to this video later, but for now, I want you to remember the kind of mindset that's required to realize our empathy is not a problem solver's mindset, but rather a paradox resolver's mindset. The second difference I want to talk about is a difference in values. Problem solving values the knowledge we have to judge what's right, wrong, good, or bad. When realizing empathy, we instead value the creation or discovery of new meaning and value from what we already assume to know. Now, let me tell you another story to illustrate what I mean by this. When I turned 40, I took a time to reflect on my 20-year career. And I've come to think of myself as having had a pivotal moment in the 10-year mark. And that 10-year mark happened when I was researching how artists innovate differently from designers. And because I didn't want to do the research merely by observation or by reading journals, I made art myself with wood, metal, clay, plastic, glass, among other materials. And I also went beyond visual art to venture into performing arts through dancing and acting. Among all these types of art, one of my favorite was making furniture out of wood. Has anybody made furniture out of wood? Ooh, awesome. So have you used a handsaw when you were making? Okay, awesome. So this is the picture of the handsaw I used when I was making furniture. And this is what the saw sounded like. So one day, I was trying to figure out how to saw straight and clean, and it was not going very well. But after a few tries, the carpenter standing at the other end of the wood shop starts yelling at me. And he says, "Hey, you, listen to the wood." And I was like, the wood's not speaking to me. And as I stood there dumbfounded, he starts walking towards me and he says, "The wood is very honest. If you're willing to listen, it will speak to you." Then once he got near, he unclamped the wood I'd been sawing, lowered it down, reclamped it, and said, "Do it again." And I did it again. And this is how the sound changed. And once again, hear the previous sound, the same saw, same wood. Big difference, no? But here's the thing. I had heard that sound. But to borrow the carpenter's expression, I was not listening. This is what I mean by creating new meaning and value from what we already assume to know. When I first heard the sound of sawing, I just assumed it was what sawing sounded like. So I didn't find it meaningful or valuable. But what I learned from the carpenter was this. I'd clamped the wood too high. So every time I sawed, it wobbled slightly. And because it was wobbling, it was making this extra rumbling noise, and I couldn't saw straight and clean. Now let's pause here for a second. How did I learn to make this new meaning and value? By hearing the sound from the carpenter's perspective. I want you to remember the story of me and my friend with depression. How did I learn to make new meaning and value from that situation? By seeing the situation from my friend's perspective. Now let's return to the video. Are you ready to empathize with the video? Here we go. What did you see? Yeah. From a different perspective, it's not a hill. Without a new perspective, it's very difficult to empathize with someone whom you cannot yet empathize. Do you know what this kind of new perspective is also called? It's called an insight. Once again, I want you to remember the story of me and my friend with depression. What helped me empathize with her was the insight that she may be feeling the way she was, not because of her depression, but because of something hurtful I had said. That insight was nothing more than seeing the situation from a new perspective, namely hers, not mine. And that's why when realizing empathy, instead of valuing the knowledge we already have to judge what's right, wrong, good, or bad, we value the creation or discovery of new meaning and value from what we already assume to know. Because that's the way to a creative insight. And it's through such a creative insight that we have breakthrough our state of being stuck and arrive at a whole new level of understanding that fundamentally shifts the way we perceive the situation. Now let me share the third difference, which is a difference in focus. Problem solving focuses on solving the problem that it sets out to solve. Realizing empathy, on the other hand, focuses on clarifying and regulating the tension in the system. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll tell you one last story to explain that. So a few years ago, I was coaching a CEO of a startup, and he was determined to innovate. But he came to the realization that the biggest problem he had was that he didn't have the right team. And when I asked him why, he said, in the past, my team contributed lots of new ideas. But the moment the company started experiencing financial trouble, they stopped contributing. He couldn't believe that his team would be so easily swayed by money. And this was a very mission and purpose-driven company. So in addition to coaching him privately, I also got his permission to interview his team so I can better understand what's really going on. And to my surprise, the team said that the problem was the CEO. The situation as a team saw it was like this. The company was, in fact, in financial trouble. So everyone had agreed to seek outside investment. And the CEO had volunteered to get investment. Then after about a month, they had an update meeting. And after roughly 2 hours, the CEO patiently shared the details of who he'd met, what they'd talked about, and what kind of potential lay in the relationships he'd formed. Now, as he was saying this, what do you think the team was thinking? There's really only one thing that they were thinking. Did we get the money or not? So after a while, one of the team members raised her hand bravely and asked, well, this is all great, but do you think we'll get the money? And the CEO froze. After a short pause, he said, have you been listening? To which she responded, oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm just curious if we're going to get the money or not. And the CEO said, you're not listening. You're just sitting around waiting for money to fall from the sky. And the whole room went silent. And eventually the CEO said, never mind, I'll figure it out. And out he went, slamming the door. Now, what did the team experience here? The word I want to use is tension. Tension is a conflict between what our mind needs or values versus what it has instead. Think of music with tension. When we hear music like this, our mind needs and values a sense of resolution. And so it expects or wants the music to end on a note that gives us that sense of resolution. But that note has yet to play. So what do we experience? Tension. Now, what do you think was the source of the team's tension? What I learned from them is that they needed a sense of security and clarity. While they didn't expect the CEO to fulfill their need for security, they at least wanted to have that fulfill their sense of clarity. They wanted some clarification. But what did they get instead? An expression of indignance and resentment. So what happened as a result? They felt even less secure and less clear. Their tension got worse. What happened since then was that the team members stopped contributing because they were afraid of being shot down by the CEO. And this, from the CEO's perspective, looked like the team was not contributing because of the financial trouble they were in. Now let's flip this around. How do you think the CEO felt? What I know from being his private coach, that he talks to 2 to 4 customers or investors a day. Now let's say he works 5 days a week, which he didn't. He worked 7 days a week. That means he talks to around at least 60 people a month. Now what kind of things do you think he was hearing from these people? A lot of unpleasant things. It turns out, from the investors in particular, he was constantly being rejected. In other words, by the time he came to the update meeting, he'd been rejected 60 times. He's been in a significant tension. What do you think he needed? What he told me was that he needed to feel appreciated. He told me that meeting with and speaking to customers and investors felt like fighting in a war. Why? Because he was getting hurt every day. So when he finally returned home to his company and met with his family, his team, his mind subconsciously was needing an expression of appreciation for the difficult task of being constantly hurt, or rejected. But what did he get instead? Did you bring us our money or not? That's what he heard instead. So his tension was not relieved either. And in that moment, he probably felt isolated and lonely. For me, coaching the CEO helped me understand my father better. Because my father was a salesman, and I'm willing to bet that every night he came home wounded all over his mind. By his customers, by his boss, whomever he crossed paths with. Yet all I ever said was, why do you come home so late? Why don't you spend more time with me? Where are my toys? I only complained. Not once did I express my appreciation or condolence for his efforts. He was merely getting in the way of my happiness. Perhaps I was too young and immature. When we experience too much tension, it's only natural that we want to problem solve. Think about it. Is tension comfortable or uncomfortable? Uncomfortable. In fact, after a certain threshold, it can be painful. Now, is something that's uncomfortable and painful good or bad? Bad. What's another word for something that's bad? It's a problem. What do we want to do when there's a problem? We want to solve it. When we experience too much tension, even our loved ones become problems to be solved. So to realize our empathy, we must have room in our being to do so. To make room, we have to regulate the tension we hold, whether by ourselves or with the help of others. Now, what's interesting is that when we're able to regulate not only the tension we hold, but the tension held by others, what happens is they experience gratitude. Remember back to the story I told of my depressed friend. What do you think was her tension? What did she need? She probably wanted to feel understood, seen, to matter. Now, what did I do to regulate that tension, although unintentionally? I apologized. And that apology was received by my friend as worthy of her gratitude, which I'm grateful for too. But not only that, but she also seemed surprised. Why? Because she didn't expect me to apologize. Now, do you know what's another name for this apology? Something that gives you a sense of gratitude and surprise? It's innovation. Innovation is not such a complicated idea. It's basically any expression that's so meaningful and valuable to someone that it inspires not only their surprise, but also their resonance or gratitude. Innovative art, innovative products, innovative services, they're all the same. My friend felt both surprise and gratitude in response to my apology. That means it was sufficiently innovative to her. Now, of course, this may be small or even micro-innovation, but large-scale innovation is nothing more than a multiplication of countless micro-innovations. Think about it. To make large-scale innovation possible, does it not require the cooperation of many people with different perspectives? At the very least, we need the cooperation of a variety of customers or patients. Now, what if we need the cooperation of marketing, engineering, design, sales, finance? When working with these people, it's inevitable that we run into situations when we cannot empathize with one another. So unless we produce enough micro-innovations with enough variety of people, we cannot make large-scale innovations possible. Now, there's a common misunderstanding that realizing our empathy is merely about being sensitive to others, feeling for them, or behaving nicely and politely towards them. No. I believe realizing empathy is a way to produce solutions not through problem solving, but through the paradigm shifting process of innovation. And at the heart of innovation is the regulation of tension held by ourselves and others. So these are the three things I wanted to share today. And I want to close by saying that I believe we live in a time where we're in a dire need for more empathy, insight, and innovation. Last year, I gave a talk at Cleveland Clinic, and what I heard was patients moving testimonials on how their doctors were treating them as mere problems to be solved. I also heard hospital administrators respond to those complaints with the promise of empathy training for doctors. But what struck me the most was when one hospital administrator said, each year, 7% of doctors are leaving the field of medicine due to burnout. She asked us to reflect on that fact as well. Can you imagine? What do you think a doctor stressed out enough to burn out will say when the hospital mandates they take empathy training? Do only patients matter? Doctors matter too. That hospital administrator had realized that if we're not careful, we may end up treating the doctors as problems to be solved. That if we're not careful, we'll do the same thing we do not want the doctors to do to their patients. What I see from all this is that there's a general awareness that's growing, an awareness that's making it clear by day that problem solving, while it has its merits, also has its limits and can even make things worse. And that we need to think about empathy not only in relation to one group of people, but all groups of people involved. And my hope is that this is something we feel not only at an individual level, but at an organizational level, because we can't do this alone. So if you're in a position of senior leadership in any organization where you're seeing the same thing, I genuinely hope you're willing to bring more empathy into your organization. Not because it's nice or morally right, but because it's the only way we can get past being stuck making things worse. And if you're not in a position of senior leadership, but would like to bring greater empathy into your organization, I sincerely hope you're willing to start small. Start by producing micro innovations with people right around you. And I invite you to be patient, to take it a step at a time, because organizational change may take longer than you'd like. But if you don't start, it will never happen. So I urge you to take one step. Thank you.